to talk about communist revolution and its importance in 20th century world history. There are two major communist revolutions in the 20th century. The first, in 1918, the Russian Revolution, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. The second, 1949, the Chinese Communist Revolution, led by Mao Zedong. These two revolutions were the model for many anti-imperialist movements and revolutions across, in particular, the second half of the 20th century in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. These movements came out of a much longer tradition of mass politics. You notice we have a lot of mass items in this course. Mass consumption, mass production, mass distribution. We also have a mass mobilization for war. We also have mass politics. Mass politics is a key factor in 20th century world history and is really a new thing. This is the first period in history in which large groups of people get together and influence the political process via three main techniques. First, the expansion of voting rights. Over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century in Western democracies, the voting rights were extended first to male workers, then to women. Popular political parties were formed. And suddenly, individuals, even workers, even those of low means, had a voice in political process. Second, worker strikes emerged as a powerful tool for workers to influence their economic and social environment. Workers went on strike, demanding things like, in this image, the 8-hour day, 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours for leisure and education. This was the first global workers' movement, took place in 1891, and succeeded in many countries in installing some maximum length of time which employers could demand that their workers stay on the job. Another technique, street demonstrations. So this group of people is gathering not at a workplace, but in a public square, most likely, listening to speeches by political leaders. These techniques, these tactics, were used worldwide, and really, in many cases, shook the boots, sometimes even toppled traditional political leadership and governments. Socialist parties came out of these mass political workers' movements. Socialism was a form of mass politics that emphasized workers' rights and the sharing of profits from workers' labor, a political voice for workers, and breaking the hold of a few elite people on the social and economic life of a nation. Some socialists tried to accomplish their goals democratically. They ran for office. Others believed that revolution was the only way forward, that the elites would not give up power without a fight. Communism came out of socialism. Communism was socialism, but with a twist, a vanguard party to lead the masses forward. And we'll talk more about that. So this political program, socialist communist revolution, succeeded in two countries, two major countries, in Russia in 1917 at the tail end of the First World War, and in China in 1949 at the tail end, the post-World War II. Neither of those dates are accidents, of course. But something a little strange about those two countries. Socialist revolution was supposed to happen in highly industrialized nations. Workers in the factories would rise up and take control of the means of production. There was a little problem with that in Russia and China. Namely, almost everyone in these two countries were peasants. Here's a group of Russian peasants from the late 19th century. A group of Chinese peasants from around about the same time period. These countries did not appear ripe for communist revolution. But Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, sitting out the war in a cafe in Switzerland, thought he found a solution to this problem. He, instead of waiting for workers to advance to a high level of development, education, and industrialization, he would form a vanguard party that would lead the masses forward. A small, ideologically homogeneous group of professional revolutionaries would do the revolution for the people, and the people would follow and benefit from it. Mao adopted exactly the same model. So what this meant, in essence, was taking these peasants and mobilizing them. Another problem, the Communist Revolution was supposed to happen in democratic nations. It was supposed to be the next phase. There would be a revolution against traditional monarchies. That would be the Democratic Revolution, the Bourgeois Revolution, and then there would be a revolution against that one, led by the workers. Well, in both Russia and China, up until the 19-teens, traditional dynastic monarchies reigned. So neither of these countries, again, appeared ripe. But on the other hand, the wars and other conditions, other movements weakened the power of these monarchs, and vanguard communist parties took advantage of this opening to push for revolution. These two communist revolutions in Russia and China mobilized people against two major enemies. First, capitalists. Here's a Soviet propaganda poster referring to the major capitalist powers of the day, the Americans, the Brits, and essentially, oppressing the workers, the fat cats sitting on their chairs. They mobilized peasants, in particular, against rich landowners. So capitalists, number one enemy. Number two enemy, and these were closely connected for communists, were imperialists. Now, Russia was not occupied by an imperialist power, but China was semi-colonized. That is, it was not an official colony of any one country, but essentially all of the European powers had carved out, as you can see in this cartoon here, a sphere of influence. China obviously is not a pie, but you understand what I mean. They carved out spheres of influence in the country and occupied. So that's why there's beer in the south of China. That was the German territory. So second enemy, imperialists. These were communist revolutions against capitalism and against imperialism, led by peasants and workers who followed the lead of a small group of professional revolutionaries, the Vanguard Party. This vanguard mobilized mass demonstrations, the tools of mass politics, demonstrations in the street like this one in November of 1917, calling for the establishment of worker-led Soviets, and mobilization of these same peasants and workers to fight in the Russian Civil War, in which the communists suppressed their social democratic rivals after the fall of the monarch. Here in China, mass demonstrations, mobilization of the masses, and mobilization to fight. In this case, to fight first against the Japanese, who occupied China during the Second World War, and then against their rivals, the nationalists. So peasants were turned in first to soldiers. And here, Chinese case. After the communists were victorious in 1918 in Russia, in 1949 in China, these same peasants were then mobilized to work for the industrial development of the new communist country. So here you have a Russian propaganda poster urging people to work hard for the new nation. And here, a Chinese propaganda poster calling on workers and peasants turned into workers to think of the Soviet Union as their model. So we have mass mobilization. We have the use of propaganda tools, as these posters illustrate. But in addition to mobilizing mass movements of peasants and workers, communist revolutions not only wanted to get rid of capitalists and imperialists, they wanted to change the whole conditions of life. They wanted to change the way of life, the way of thinking, the culture of people in these new communist nations. So in both Russia and China, farmland was taken away from rich landowners and collectivized, turned into huge collective farms in which every person had a role. Childcare was meant to be collectivized. Women would no longer be in the kitchen preparing for their families. They would be out on tractors doing the hard labor just like men. So there was an idea that there would be equality between the sexes in a new communist society. Didn't work out quite that way, but this was the model, a total transformation of society. Here in China, you see rich landowners, notables being put on trial, being dispossessed of their land, which was then distributed to peasants. And some 300 million peasants in China, out of a total population in China at that time, in the late 1940s, of around 450 million, received land. So that's basically 2/3, in fact, exactly 2/3 of the Chinese population who had no land, who were essentially dependent on rich landowners to survive, now had their own plot of land. During the first phase of land reform in the Chinese Revolution, the agrarian reform of 1950. So we're talking about a fundamental social transformation. Property was taken away from capitalists, from those who owned land, from those who owned factories, and collectivized, nationalized. All of this was done by the communist state. Mao Zedong, once he had finished distributing land, then followed the Soviet example in another way. The next phase, after redistributing land to the peasants, those peasants who had brought the communists to power, the next phase was to develop industry. The Soviets focused a massive centralized building of dams, of dikes, of waterways, of railways, and the Chinese followed suit in the 1950s. They wanted an iron smelting plant in the backyard of every farm. They collectivized farms, just as the Soviets, the Russian communists had done, bringing thousands of people, sometimes 10,000 people lived on a single collective farm. Now, not all of these experiments worked. It turned out that iron smelting, not so efficient in a backyard. The Great Leap Forward, which was the name for this program of collectivization, happened at the same time as a climate crisis and resulted in massive famine. Some 15 to 25 million people died in 1960 to 1961. So peasants died of famine. Partly as a result of the Great Leap Forward, partly as a result just of bad luck, bad harvests. So the Chinese Communist Party then renewed its revolution, sought to effect yet another transformation of society. And under Mao Zedong, in the late 1960s, instituted something called the Cultural Revolution. Groups of young people rose up, carrying Mao Zedong's red book of his quotations, and denounced their elders. Intellectuals and directors of museums, people in the professional classes were forced to go to the countryside and work in these collective farms. Many of them starved as a result. And in fact, the young members of the drivers of the Cultural Revolution were so enthusiastic, they almost toppled the Communist Party itself. They kept announcing its leaders. More and more people were being purged. This was constant revolution, permanent revolution. And in a moment, Mao Zedong realized that if he wanted to remain in power and maintain a communist state, he needed to calm this process down. So what we're talking about here is a mass mobilization. It's a mass mobilization meant to redistribute property and also meant to transform the way that people live. This model was very powerful, particularly in the way that it positioned itself against Western capitalists and imperialists, and had a great deal of influence, as I mentioned, in colonies in Southeast Asia and in Africa and in the Caribbean. These regimes also turned out to be very long-lived. The Russian Communist Party The Soviet Union survived from 1918 all the way to 1991. In the 1980s, it began to crumble. A new reform program was instituted of political openness. Suddenly, people could say what they thought, whereas before there was serious censorship and sometimes purges. People were jailed or sent to Siberia for criticizing the Communist Party. And as a result of this and the political upheavals that followed, the Soviet Union collapsed. Almost at exactly the same time, in 1989, there was an uprising called the Tiananmen Square movement, in which students and workers allied themselves, occupied the square, and began to demand democratic reform by the Chinese Communist Party. This, however, had a very different result than in the Russian case. In the Soviet case, these students were first met politely, but within a month, the Chinese Communist Party sent soldiers in tanks to remove the students. They used live ammunition, and some 150 students died as a result of the suppression of this movement. The news of this movement, knowledge of this movement, is to this day suppressed by the Chinese Communist Party. It's very hard to get information about the Tiananmen Square movement within China itself. And the damage to democratic hopes in China was severe. So while the Soviet Union collapsed as a result of a more democratic opening, the Chinese Communist Party went a very different tact. Starting in the 1970s, after the death of Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party began to open up its economy to more free market models, leaving behind its anti-capitalist beginnings. But on the other hand, politically, it remains, to this day, a repressive state. I talked about how influential this model of revolution was. And you can see this directly in a case like Cuba. A communist revolution led by Fidel Castro in 1959 directly inspired itself. Fidel was directly inspired by the ideas of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, publicly and tactically, mobilizing peasants against capitalists, promising land reform, and militarizing, asking the masses to follow a very, very tightly hierarchical and militarized vanguard party. Similar sort of movement occurred in Vietnam in the post-World War II era, although this became a more explicitly anti-imperialist movement fighting against the French occupiers and then later the Americans. Ho Chi Minh directly inspired by the Chinese Communist Party. So revolution here has a really long tail. And it has influence not only in the countries I mentioned, in other places like Angola, but beyond the countries where communist revolution occurred, communist ideas were extremely influential worldwide. They provided a language to critique imperialism, to critique capitalism. So it's very important to understand where they're coming from. We tend to think of them as either sort of antiquated or sort of demons today, but they really offered hope to an enormous group of people who had no political power and no ability to control their own economic or social or cultural destiny. So let me go back and return for a few minutes to the basic ideas behind this program. I want to talk about socialism. As I mentioned, socialism is a form of mass politics. It mobilizes people. It mobilizes workers and peasants in mass street demonstrations, in armed conflict, and as workers for a new communist state. So socialism is a form of mass politics. It's not the only form out there. There were many. But socialism is a particular form that demands redistribution. That is, it demands that economic goods, land, factories, all of the products of factories, the mass-produced products that began to become available in the early 20th century, be available to workers, to those who actually produce them. They also demanded essentially political power for the common people. There are many types of socialism. Revolutionary socialism is only one of them. So communism is a form of socialism. It's a form of socialism that believes that revolution is the way to go. That the only political change that will allow workers and peasants to have access to the fruits of their labor is by fighting, by overturning by force the existing elites in power. And the way to do this, what distinguishes communism from socialism, is the vanguard. This is a tightly organized group, homogeneous. They all ascribe to the same political program. They're militarized, they're hierarchical, and they consider themselves responsible for leading the masses into revolution. So revolution would not simply arise out of the common people, but rather the common people would be organized, mobilized, led, and told what to think and to do and say by this vanguard. This is the model for revolution, which was then picked up first by the Chinese and then by others in a fight against, and here are the enemies, capitalism and imperialism. So revolution identified some of the major elements of 20th century politics and economics, mass politics, capitalism, and imperialism, and decided to combat them using the techniques of vanguard party and mobilization through revolution.